3 weeks ago, near midnight, a weight settled low in my chest that didn't belong to anything in my life that week.
It didn't feel like mine.
There's an old belief, far older than any phone, that when a person quietly stops doing one small thing, something moves in to fill the space left behind. And if you think looking away costs nothing, wait until you understand what fills the space you leave empty. The Egyptians gave that force a name, Isfet lie disorder, the static that moves in the moment order gets neglected.
Great is Maat, lasting in effect.
Not a war they expected to win, a habit they expected you to keep, fed daily or lost.
He only needs you to be absent.
Disconnection is not neutral, it is the exact mechanism by which Isfet gains ground. So before you close this and look away again, ask the only question that ever mattered.
What can I still offer, even now?
3 weeks ago, a little before midnight, on an ordinary Tuesday, I wasn't doing anything that mattered. Phone lit up in the dark, thumb moving from one headline to the next. The way it does once your body stopped being tired, but your mind hasn't caught up yet. Rain against the window. I barely noticed it until later. Somewhere around the 20th headline, something settled low in my solar plexus. Not sadness exactly, a weight, an urgency that didn't belong to anything actually happening in my life that week. Nothing was wrong with me, and it didn't feel like mine. For a few seconds, I reached for the easy answer, that this is just what everyone feels now, the ordinary tax of owning a phone in a bad year. It almost worked. Almost. Underneath it sat a quieter thought I couldn't talk myself out of, that calling a real signal noise, only because noise was easier to carry, would be a small dishonesty I wasn't willing to commit that night. If you've ever felt that, a heaviness with no cause you can name, like you scrolled straight into someone else's exhaustion, hold it for a second. Notice right now whether there's a contraction or an opening low in your gut or your chest. Don't judge whatever's there, just notice it. Keep it close. We're coming back to it. There's an old belief, far older than any phone, that when a person quietly stops doing one small thing, something moves in to take the space left behind, not with force, not all at once, just by filling whatever room it's given. If you think looking away costs nothing, that protecting your peace by disconnecting is a neutral, harmless move, wait until you understand what this belief says actually happens in the space you leave empty. What was filling the space I left open that night? Was the weight in my chest even mine to carry? And why did an entire civilization build its whole moral life around the idea that the answer had to be renewed every single day, forever, or it stopped counting? To understand that, we have to go back 4,000 years to a ritual almost nobody alive still performs inside a civilization that lasted longer than almost any other in human history. Because what I want to show you tonight is what they actually believed about moments exactly like the one I just described to you, and it's not what most spiritual content tells you. Most of it tells you to disconnect, protect your peace, retreat inward until the noise passes. I'm going to show you why the people who built that civilization would have called that advice a mistake, and the 4 things they believed you had to keep doing instead every day, so that something they called Isfet never got to fill the space you left behind. The Egyptians gave a name to the force that fills empty space, Isfet, lie, disorder. The static that moves in the moment order gets neglected. And they gave a name to the thing that holds it back, Maat, truth, balance, right action, sustained. The scribes who wrote about Ma credited its teaching to Thoth, the one who recorded what was real, not what was convenient. The Greeks who later encountered him folded him into Hermes Trismegistus, 3 times great, the name under which the Hermetic texts this whole video is built on were eventually written down. Same figure, same function, a keeper, not a warrior. I'm telling you who he was because the title of this video isn't decorative. Everything I'm about to walk you through is drawn from what's actually attributed to him and the tradition built in his name, not aesthetic Egyptian window dressing borrowed to make a spiritual video sound more serious than it is. And in the oldest ethical text Egypt left behind, the instruction of Ptahhotep, dated to the Middle Kingdom, one line has survived for 4,000 years. In Miriam Lichheim's translation, "Great is Maat, lasting in effect." Not a war Thoth expected anyone to win, a habit he expected people to keep. That distinction is the entire spine of this video. I'm not quoting a metaphor, I'm quoting a structure that is repeated for 4,000 years, and I think it repeated again 3 weeks ago in my bed at midnight. Here's what almost nobody teaches about that structure. The Egyptians didn't leave maintaining Maat vague. Jan Assmann, the Egyptologist, whose work on this subject is still the academic standard, documented that it came down to something specific, a ritual and a discipline that in practice reduced to 4 moves. I'll walk you through all 4 before this video ends, and by the end, you'll have done them yourself tonight on whatever is sitting in your solar plexus right now. But before I give you the first one, sit with a harder question. The same one I had to sit with at midnight 3 weeks ago. Was that weight actually yours? Hold that, don't answer it yet. We'll come back to it in a few minutes, and I want you to notice, honestly, whether you're able to answer it without forcing anything. I want to give you the actual mechanics of that answer before I ask you to trust me on anything else. Where it comes from historically, why a Princeton lab spent decades quietly asking a version of the same question, and what it looked like in practice 4,000 years before either of us existed. Picture the actual ritual because it's stranger and more literal than balance as an abstract idea. Temple reliefs across Egypt show the pharaoh kneeling, presenting a small figure of Maat to the gods, barely the size of a hand. The figure itself was tiny, a few inches of gold or faience, small enough to fit in a palm, which is almost the point. The offering was never meant to look proportionate to the size of what it was holding back. Every day, not once, not at coronation, not during a crisis, daily. Assmann's research is clear on why. Maat was never treated as a state that once achieved, simply held. It was understood as something that had to be fed continuously by ordinary right action, truth spoken instead of distorted, honest dealing instead of convenient lying. Isfet was never a rival army waiting at the border. It was just what filled the room the moment that feeding stopped. And critically, this offering was never described as the pharaoh's job alone. Ptahhotep himself wasn't royalty. He was a vizier writing instructions for his own son, the kind of practical household ethics you'd hand down at a kitchen table, not carve into a temple wall. That's what convinces me this was never meant as elite theology. It was meant as something an ordinary household could actually execute on a Tuesday. The maintenance of cosmic order in Egyptian thought was distributed, thousands of small, unglamorous offerings made by people who would never be remembered, holding back something a single grand gesture never could have held back on its own. I think that's the part modern spiritual advice quietly loses. It treats your personal practice as too small to matter against something the size of a global news cycle. The Egyptians built an entire civilizational theology on the opposite premise. Scale was never the criteria, consistency was. There's a reason this shows up in the funerary texts too, not just the temple reliefs. The heart, weighed against the feather of Maat at death, wasn't judged against some cosmic average. It was judged against the accumulation of a single life's ordinary choices, the small offerings, or their absence, stacked one on top of the other until they were the only thing left to weigh. There's a text that takes this further, and it's the part of the Hermetic corpus most people skip because it's the least comfortable to read. It's called the Lament, the closing section of the Asclepius, composed in Egypt sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century, preserved for us in the Latin translation included in Brian Copenhaver's 1992 Cambridge edition of the Hermetica. The Lament describes a future in which the gods withdraw, impiety replaces true religion, and the sacredness of Egypt itself is forgotten, mistaken for foolishness by the very people living through it. Copenhaver's translation doesn't soften it. Hermes describes people who will call the ordering of the world madness by the time it's actually needed most, the exact inversion where restraint looks foolish and absence looks like freedom. Most readers treat that as apocalyptic prophecy, a single ending, a curtain falling once. My reading is different. I don't think it's describing one collapse. I think it's describing a cycle, negligence, followed eventually by restoration. And if that's right, this video was never about waiting for the collapse to finish. It's about what each person does while it's still in progress. Even Plotinus, 3 centuries later, described the soul's return to order not as one rescuing act, but as continuous virtuous action, repeated the same shape in a completely different philosophical language. None of these 3 sources knew about the other 2 the way we do now, sitting centuries apart, but they keep describing the same mechanism. Order interrupted, not permanently, but through neglect that has to be actively reversed rather than just waited out. I think this is also part of why so many people report their first real spiritual awakening not during calm, easy years, but during exactly the kind of collapse this text describes. Not because crisis is good, because crisis is the condition under which people finally stop scrolling past what they'd normally ignore. That's not a guarantee, it's a pattern, and I'm only comfortable calling it that because it shows up this consistently. If you started tonight already living in that inversion, watching restraint get mocked as naivety everywhere you look, that's not a sign the text is wrong. According to the Lament, that's exactly the symptom it predicted. Hermes did not write the Lament as poetry, he wrote it as warning, and I am not quoting a metaphor, I am quoting a structure that keeps repeating. What strikes me most, rereading it this month, is what the Lament promises comes after the forgetting. Not nothing, not permanent ruin, restoration eventually, once enough of the old order is remembered and reoffered. That's a strange kind of comfort. It doesn't promise the collapse won't happen. It promises the collapse was never the end of the story, either time it's happened before. I trust Copenhaver's translation specifically because it doesn't try to smooth the Lament into something more palatable than it is. No soft ending added, no reassurance inserted where the original text doesn't offer one. The restoration it describes isn't automatic. It happens because, eventually, enough of what was forgotten gets remembered and reoffered by people who never stopped being willing to do it. Here's where it gets stranger and where I want to be careful because this is the part of the video most likely to get misquoted. In 1997, a Princeton University research team led by Roger Nelson, building on 2 decades of work at Princeton's Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, launched something called the Global Consciousness Project. It's a worldwide network of random number generators, constantly monitored for statistical deviation, checked against moments when huge numbers of people focus the same fear or attention at the same time. 9/11, the start of wars, New Year's Eve. Nelson's project does not prove a global field exists. Mainstream science does not treat it as settled, and I won't pretend otherwise. What it does is keep a real open question alive. When millions of people direct the same emotional attention at once, does anything measurable move in the world around them? I'm not presenting that as proof. I'm presenting it as a question serious enough that a Princeton-affiliated lab spent decades taking seriously. The network itself is unglamorous. Dozens of these generators sitting quietly in labs and homes on almost every continent, logging noise nobody usually looks at twice. It only becomes interesting in hindsight when researchers go back and check the record against a list of dates nobody told the machines about in advance. Now put that next to something written in 1930, not from any ancient papyrus, and I say that plainly, by a British occultist named Dion Fortune in a book called Psychic Self-Defense. Fortune described thought forms, energetic structures that gain strength every time collective attention feeds them and lose strength the moment that attention stops. And put that next to something a practicing psychiatrist, Judith Orloff, wrote in 2017 about highly sensitive people, that they absorb collective emotional exhaustion that was never theirs to begin with, often without ever locating where it came from. I'm not a doctor. I have no clinical standing to evaluate her research, but I recognize the description she's giving better than I'd like to. Fortune wrote for occultists guarding against deliberate psychic attack. Orloff writes for patients who've never used a word like egregore in their life and never will. Neither one had the other in mind. That's the part that makes the overlap worth noticing instead of dismissing. A Princeton lab, a 1930s occultist, a working psychiatrist, three fields that never sighted each other, never spoke to each other, arriving at the same shape from three different directions. I'm not saying a random number generator proves an Egyptian offering ritual real. I'm saying something more precise. What you feed with attention grows, and what you stop feeding starts to lose its hold, and that pattern shows up everywhere serious people have actually looked for it. I know what the skeptical version of you is thinking right now, that stacking three unrelated sources next to each other isn't evidence, it's just three anecdotes wearing a trench coat. Fair, I'm not asking you to treat the convergence as proof. I'm asking you to notice that if the ancient description were simply wrong, you'd expect these three fields to contradict each other instead of quietly rhyming. And the word worldwide in the title of this video isn't rhetorical either. The Global Consciousness Project's network spans continents on purpose. The entire design assumes that whatever it's measuring, if it's real at all, doesn't respect a single country's borders any more than a headline does the night it goes global. Maybe that's close to where you started this video, watching everything fracture at once and quietly deciding your own effort is too small to be worth the energy. I know that state well. It's the one I was sitting in 3 weeks ago, phone in hand, telling myself none of this was mine to carry. So here's my actual disagreement with most spiritual advice about times like this. It tells you disconnection is neutral, that protecting your peace by looking away costs nothing. I don't think that's true anymore. Disconnection is not neutral. It's the exact mechanism by which Isfet gains ground, not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped doing something small and necessary. If Maat genuinely needed daily maintenance to exist, the question was never, how do I stop the chaos in the world? No individual offering was ever built to carry that weight, and pretending otherwise is what makes the whole practice feel pointless. The real question is smaller and much harder to hide from. What did I stop offering? That question takes away the excuse of scale. Isfet doesn't need you to lose a war, it only needs you to be absent. My thesis isn't that a personal spiritual practice fixes world events. It never was, and I'm not going to pretend it is to make this feel bigger than it should. My thesis is this: Maat was never a victory condition. It was, and still is, a maintenance condition. And every time someone decides their small offering doesn't matter against something this large, that is the exact moment Isfet was built to win. I don't say any of this to make you feel guilty for the nights you didn't have anything left to offer. Maat was never sustained by any single person's perfect record either. It was sustained by enough people, most days, doing something instead of nothing. One missed night was never the mechanism. Absence as a pattern is. That's the whole difference between a person having a hard month and a person who has quietly decided the offering isn't worth making anymore, and it's worth being honest with yourself about which one you're actually in. So let's go back to that weight in your solar plexus, the one I asked you to notice at the start. Here is the offering I actually built for the version of this problem I live with 3 weeks ago and most weeks since. I want to be clear about something first. This is not a reconstruction of an ancient temple ritual. I have no papyrus for this. It's my own small practice, built from how the offering of Maat actually worked, not as one grand act, but as something renewed daily, on a scale small enough for one person to actually keep. It has 4 moves. First, pause wherever you are and name one concrete truth you're not going to distort today, even a small one, not a grand confession, something specific and true. Second, name one right action you already took today, however minor it feels. Egyptian ethics never asked for heroism. It asked for something done correctly, on record, however small, showing up when you said you would, telling someone the truth you almost softened into a lie, not adding to the noise you just spent a section of this video describing. Third, and this is the part I added myself, because naming a contraction never actually released it for me, find where the weight sits in your body. Usually it's the solar plexus, sometimes the chest, the same place Isfet seems to sit in mine. Don't just name it. Breathe into it a few slow breaths and let yourself feel that stuck energy start to move, rising and settling through the body instead of staying locked in one place until the grip loosens even slightly. You're not trying to push the feeling out or shove it away. You're letting it circulate the way it was always meant to, the way it would have if you hadn't been holding a phone lit up in the dark for 20 minutes straight. Fourth, only once that eases, notice whatever expansion is left. Don't force a feeling that isn't there. Just notice what remains once the contraction has moved. That small expansion is what reclaiming your light actually looks like. Not a grand awakening, a held line, again on schedule. That night, the concrete truth I named was small, that I was more tired than I wanted to admit. The right action was smaller still, a single honest message to someone I'd been avoiding, instead of the nothing I'd been offering by staying silent. Neither one fixed the news cycle, neither one was supposed to. One more note, because people always ask this, the offering doesn't need to feel dramatic to count. Most nights mine barely registers as anything happening at all, a small ease, nothing cinematic. That's not a sign it failed. Egyptian ritual never measured Maat by how large the ceremony felt. It measured it by whether it happened again the next day. Now, the harder part, the question I told you to hold earlier, was that weight actually yours? That night I ran it through the 4 possibilities I always check before I trust a reading like that. Ordinary emotional reaction ruled out. Nothing that specific had happened in my actual day. Intuition ruled out too. Intuition is usually your mind synthesizing something you already half know, and this had no runway, no prior thought leading into it. Clairsentience, the best fit, a specific energetic texture, a contraction with urgency attached that didn't originate in my own day. External influence, not ruled out at all. Scrolling mass media at that hour is by definition direct exposure to a field of collective attention, so if anything that's less a competing explanation and more a description of the mechanism itself. Here's the practical version, so you can run this yourself. Imagining a feeling takes effort. You have to construct it, hold it in place, work to keep it there. Actually perceiving something is the opposite. It arrives without you building it, whether or not you wanted it to. If you relax and the sensation is simply there, unforced, that's more likely a real reading of something outside you. If you have to strain to feel it, it's more likely common anxiety, and that's worth knowing too, because both deserve different responses. I can't prove which one I felt 3 weeks ago. What I can say is that the sensation had a texture I recognized as not mine, and learning to recognize that texture is the actual skill underneath everything I just taught you. That's really the whole shift, if you want it in one sentence, from someone standing outside the chaos, feeling too small to matter, to someone quietly keeping their own corner of Maat fed, not because it solves everything, but because its absence is exactly what lets Isfet spread. Isfet was never going to win by force. He was never going to need an army or a single dramatic collapse loud enough to notice. He only needed one small offering, quietly withheld because it felt too small to matter against everything wrong with the world. And 3 weeks ago, at midnight, scrolling through headline after headline, I almost gave him exactly that. Maat was never a war Thoth expected you to win alone. It was a habit he expected you to keep. So before you close this video and go back to everything that feels too big to touch, ask the only question that ever actually mattered, the one I finally asked myself that night instead of just closing the app. What can I still offer, even small, even now, not tomorrow, not once things calm down? Tonight, in whatever form is actually available to you right now. If you want me to go deeper into what a daily offering actually looks like, real examples, not just the 4 moves, type offering below. I read all of them, and it tells me whether it's worth building the next video around exactly that. I keep wondering what would actually happen if enough people did this on the same night, not as a coordinated ritual, nothing organized, just enough small, unrelated offerings landing in the same hours across enough places. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure the Global Consciousness Project could even measure something that deliberate, but it's the question I'm sitting with more than any other one this video raised, and I'd rather leave it open than force a conclusion the evidence doesn't actually support yet. Maat was never a victory condition. It was, and still is, a maintenance condition. Make yours today.